Welcome to another episode of History Now the Future, the show where we take a sharp look at some of the most pressing issues of today, using history as our guide and the future as our destination. My name is Cory. We took last week off, we're back this week, and so much has happened since we last spoke, including the first and only vice presidential debate of the 2024 election cycle. Now, traditionally, VP debates aren't that groundbreaking, and this one was no different. In fact, the Midwestern nature of the debate made it particularly less interesting for some reason, no disrespect to the Midwest, but this was the most Midwestern thing I've seen since the average 20th century late night TV show host. That's because all the main late night hosts were from the Midwest, Steve Allen, Johnny Carson, Letterman. Look, if it doesn't land, it doesn't fucking land. We just keep moving. But seriously, this debate included no real surprises. The Democratic nominee for Vice President, Tim Walz, didn't particularly stand out as exceptional. He came off as a bit nervous and understated in the beginning of the debate. He eventually warmed up, but of course he didn't wow. While Republican nominee J.D. Vance appeared confident and very self-assured. But most pathological liars contain these traits. Yes, Vance lied about pretty much everything, from making claims that Trump saved Obamacare, when in reality Trump tried to rip that legislation apart multiple times during his 4 years in office, to claiming that millions of people who have crossed the border in the past year have committed crimes in the United States. Vance even tried to spread a particularly insidious lie, claiming that Tim Walz's state of Minnesota has a law in which if a baby is born alive during an abortion, the doctors in that state aren't required to provide that baby with life-saving care, which is of course not true. Vance and other Republicans continue pushing this very false notion that there are some blue state doctors out there literally killing babies after they're born. That's called infanticide. It's illegal in all 50 states, and less than 1% of all abortions take place after 21 weeks of gestation. And for all of you who didn't pass biology class, most women give birth around 40 weeks of gestation. So literally no one is having abortions at like 37 or 38 weeks. But let's get back on track here. J.D. Vance also used the debate to continue spreading vicious lies about Haitian immigrants in Ohio, and when the debate moderators called him out on some of these lies, Vance simply responded by saying, "Hey, the fuck is up with all the fact-checking? We're not supposed to be dealing with facts here." In fact, Vance kept forgetting one crucial fact regarding this entire election. He doesn't even seem to know who the president has been for the last 3.5 years. He kept referring to the policies of the last few years as the policies of the Kamala Harris administration. I don't think this dude even knows what job he's applying for. Vice presidents don't dictate that much policy from within the administrations they serve in, unless they're a dick. Cheney. Beyond that, vice presidents usually take a very backseat role to the president. And J.D. Vance probably knows this. By constantly claiming that Biden's decisions are actually Harris decisions, I think Vance is trying to accomplish two things here. Obviously, Vance is trying to paint Harris as having some outsized role in the policy making of the Biden administration in order to place any of the flaws and mistakes of his administration solely on her. As I've said several times on this show, Trump was prepared to face Joe Biden in the general election. And when Biden dropped out, it completely upended Trump's entire campaign strategy. The Trump campaign has never fully developed a detailed strategy for dealing with Kamala Harris. They're just using the same strategy they were going to use against Joe Biden, and it's not really working, but it does require voters to completely conflate Biden with Harris when it comes to policies and the decisions of the last 4 years. I also think Vance is doing something else entirely when he refers to the Biden administration as the Harris administration. I think this is a subtle nod to J.D. Vance's intentions as vice president. I don't think he wants to play the backseat role that, say, a Dan Quayle once played. No. I think Vance has aspirations to be a very controlling, Dick Cheney-like vice president, and that's something that the Trump camp and Donald Trump himself needs to pay closer attention to. Of course, the VP debate wasn't the only thing that happened during our break. We also saw a devastating hurricane, and another one is just around the corner. More on that in a moment. And the current mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, has become the first mayor of NYC to be indicted on criminal charges while he is still mayor, which is absolutely insane, considering that none of those Tammany Hall motherfuckers went down back in the late 19th century. Can you imagine how corrupt you have to be for you to be the first NYC mayor to ever get caught? That's just bad luck at this point. But as Mayor Adams would say, New York City is a great city, and you can see anything happening on this city on any given day. Everything from a Pakistani bakery opening to a plane flying into a building, to a New York City mayor getting indicted on charges that are just plain ludicrous. These charges are as ludicrous as a rapper from Atlanta. I'm a big fan of him. Fast and Furious, those movies are great. We need to keep New York fast and furious. We need to keep the nightlife open. I'm a nightclub mayor. I'm the Biden of Brooklyn, and New York City is the Islamabad of America. Yeah, basically Eric Adams is just Tracy Morgan as a mayor. We also saw a major dock workers strike in the last week that could have devastated our entire economy and our toilet paper supply right before this crucial election. But that strike has already came and went, although it may occur again this coming January, right as the new president is coming into office. So we'll put a pin in that and come back to it later. But as you can see, things are constantly trending up and down here in the United States of America. Hey, cool segue. It's time for Trending Down. Welcome to Trending Down, where we take a look at some of the more trivial topics floating around the internet in the past week. However, this week we're not going to be looking at something trivial. We're going to be looking at something very important and very dangerous. Now, since our last episode, Hurricane Helene made landfall in the United States, and it led to a ton of unexpected damage to places that are not really prepared for hurricanes. Helene has utterly devastated areas of East Georgia, South Carolina, and a great deal of North Carolina, including mountainous regions of that state that have seen historic flooding as a result of this storm. More than 200 people have died because of this hurricane, and dozens more are still missing. Some small towns in North Carolina are apparently still inaccessible because of this major storm. Also, while we are making this recording, another historically big hurricane is bearing down on the state of Florida. And although Florida is usually more prepared for hurricanes, this one is no average storm. Hurricane Milton is currently measuring as an ultra-powerful Category 5 storm. It will be at least a Category 3 when it makes landfall, and that landfall will be occurring around the time this podcast episode is released. Milton has already led to some of the biggest evacuation efforts the state of Florida has seen in the past 7 years. Mother Nature is literally showing us that it doesn't care who we are, where we live, or what political beliefs we hold. It can destroy us at any given time, regardless of those factors. And yet, we still have idiots using social media to spread lies, conspiracy theories, and pure political propaganda regarding a natural storm. Now, this isn't the first time that a hurricane has been politicized. We all remember back in 2005 when the devastating Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast region, primarily devastating the city of New Orleans. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was blamed for its poor response back then, and of course, the George W. Bush administration was also blamed. In fact, Bush's administration would never truly recover from the resulting scandals of Hurricane Katrina. 19 years later, you would think that FEMA would be better prepared to handle these types of storms, and generally speaking, they are. In fact, FEMA was so fed up about the rumors and conspiracy theories spreading about their response to Helene that they came out with a web page just to address all these rumors, and I'm going to give you just a few facts from that page. First of all, FEMA grants do not have to be paid back as many people have been claiming online. FEMA has also not been restricting airspace over North Carolina to impede rescue efforts. That doesn't even make sense. They have been coordinating with the FAA to make sure airspace is not congested. FEMA money is not distributed based off of race, color, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, religion, age, or any of that. There's also been this ridiculous rumor going around that the damage from Hurricane Helene is being used as an excuse to go in and steal lithium from North Carolina. Now, I don't know where that came from, but the lithium deposits that do exist in North Carolina, and there are not that many of them, they weren't even in the path of this storm. So yeah, that's just complete tinfoil hat shit right there. Some people are also complaining that FEMA will only provide disaster survivors with $750 to deal with their recovery. The reality is the $750 is an upfront flexible payment that is given to survivors very soon after they apply for it. It's called Serious Needs Assistance. It doesn't have to be paid back, and it is not the only financial assistance these hurricane survivors will receive. This $750 payment didn't exist 19 years ago when Katrina happened. It's a relatively new thing, and there are other forms of assistance that you can apply for when it comes to your housing, property damage, or making repairs. Those bigger payments will take a lot longer to process. So that $750 is more immediate money intended to help you in the meantime. I've even seen some ridiculous claims that the Biden administration or Obama or Kamala Harris or some deep state entity is actually controlling these hurricanes and making them hit rural conservative areas in order to make it more difficult for those areas to vote this November. Okay, if you're delusional enough to think that the government is controlling hurricanes and using them as political weapons, then you're fucked. Excuse my language, but you are absolutely fucked. If they can control the weather, how are you going to defeat that? Like, why even complain about an entity that is that strong at this point? You do realize your semi-automatic AR-15 can't stop gale force winds, right? It's just fucking ridiculous. I also find some great irony in the fact that most of the politicizing of this storm is coming from conservative circles. The same conservatives who in Congress have been voting to curb funding for disaster relief efforts for years now. The same conservatives who have been preaching to their followers that government assistance is a bad thing and that we should all be pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. These are also the same conservatives who blindly support Donald Trump, who, new reports say, as president, tried to refuse aid to areas of California hit by devastating wildfires just because he didn't think those areas voted for him. So all of this to say, please don't listen to or spread any misinformation regarding these hurricanes. Lives are at stake here, and there are some things more important than winning an election. Today on our History Teaches Today segment, I want to use history to try to answer the question, what political system is America currently operating in? Now, the term political system can mean two different things. First, there's our two-party system, right? A system in which we have two major political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But when it comes to history and political science, the term party system can also refer to different time periods, different eras of America's political system. Each of these time periods or systems were dominated by at least two major political parties with some participation from varying third parties, and we've had at least 5 or 6 of these political systems since our country's founding. But where that fifth system ends and the sixth one begins is up for some debate. And what about the sixth system? Has it ended yet, or are we still in it? Let's figure all of that out. So the first party system began sometime around the late 1790s, and this system goes on until about the mid-1820s. This first system was dominated by two political factions in the United States, the Federalists and the original Republicans, not to be confused with the current Republican Party. The Federalists, who believed in a strong centralized government, were led by men like Alexander Hamilton and the only Federalist president, John Adams, while the early Republicans, who wanted a more decentralized government that favored states' rights, they were led by men like Thomas Jefferson. In fact, Jefferson became so famous among these men, we refer to these Republicans as Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, they are a different party from the current Republican Party, so historically, many historians refer to their party as the Democratic Republican Party. America's second political system began around 1824, in which the Democratic Republican Party falls apart in the face of the contested election of 1824, in which Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but not enough electoral college votes to win the presidency. And after a contingent election in the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams actually ended up becoming president. Jackson, angered by this, pretty much went on to develop his own political party that would go on to be known as the Democratic Party, and this is the same Democratic Party that exists today. Jackson was opposed by the Whig Party, which was mostly dominated by politicians like Henry Clay. This second political system lasted from the 1820s until about the late 1850s, in which case the third political system began. That system would actually come to be dominated by the new Republican Party, also known as the Party of Abraham Lincoln, and of course the existing Democratic Party was still a factor here. This third party system lasts from about the 1850s until roughly the mid to late 1890s. Early on, that system was dominated by the issues of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but during the Gilded Age, it mostly dealt with issues such as silver coinage, civil service reform, tariffs, things of that nature. The fourth political party system began around the late 1890s and extends until about the 1930s. This system is also known as the Progressive Era because early on it is defined by Theodore Roosevelt and his remaking of the Republican Party into a sort of progressive party, while the Democrats during this time period realigned themselves into a more populist party, mainly because of guys like William Jennings Bryan. The fifth political party system, which began in the 1930s, was sparked by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal Coalition, which is a coalition of voters who came together to support Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies in the face of the Great Depression. This New Deal coalition started breaking down sometime in the mid-1960s. However, political scientists used to disagree as to when and even if the fifth party system officially ended. Back when I first started studying these political systems in the late 2000s, some historians at that time believed that the fifth party system was still ongoing in the 2000s, which would have meant that that system extended from the 1930s all the way into the 21st century, which seems unlikely. But now most historians agree that in the 1960s or early 1970s, there was a realignment that sparked the beginning of a six-party system. Of course, that realignment deals with that infamous party switch that so many current Republicans love to pretend never happened. Starting around 1964, many Southerners, white Southerners that is, stopped voting for Democrats on the national level because of the National Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights, and instead they began voting for the Republican Party. During the same time period, the African American community began heavily supporting the Democratic Party, mainly because of the policies of presidents like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. So which political party system are we in right now? Are we still in that sixth political party system, the one that started like 60 years ago? I don't think so. I believe the six-party system ended in the 1990s with the election of Bill Clinton and his reclaiming of southern states under his New Democrat third-way centrist movement. That constituted the end of this mid-20th century Great Society, Watergate, Ronald Reagan era. I also think you got a new Republican Party out of this seventh party system with the Republican Revolution of 1994 and their contract with America, signaling a shift in the Republican Party's approach to policy and how they're going to define it to the public. So the seventh party system, in my opinion, has been lasting since the early to mid 1990s. That was about 30 years ago, and on average, these party systems usually last between 30 and 40 years or so. That means we're sort of due for a new political realignment. So could the election of 2024 lead to this realignment? It's very possible. We could be on the verge of an eighth party system. Many believe that if Donald Trump loses this election, the Republican Party will have to reform itself and find a new identity beyond MAGA conservatism. But if Trump wins, it's the Democrats that will have to figure out a new identity. That is, if the Democratic Party still exists. Remember, Donald Trump told his followers that this was the last election they would ever have to worry about. They're not even going to have to vote after this. I know. He was just joking, right? He wasn't being serious at all. But when is Trump ever being serious? Like, seriously. So there's a recent phenomenon taking place in the United States, and it involves college students. Young adults from the North are increasingly going down south for college. According to the Wall Street Journal, the number of students from the Northeast attending universities in the South increased 84% in the past 20 years, increasing 30% from 2018 to 2022. Now, of course, a lot of Southerners, many of whom didn't go to college themselves, are now bragging that these kids are coming down south for college because of their state's low cost of living, Southern hospitality, and even because of their state's conservative politics. But things are just a little bit more complicated than that. So let's put all of this into the proper perspective here. Most of this trend deals with a lower cost of living, and that's more of a concern for the parents than for the students. Of course, there are some elite universities down south, such as Tulane, Duke, and Vanderbilt, that can be just as expensive as the Ivy Leagues up north. Most public universities in the South have cheaper tuitions than their northern counterparts. It's cheaper to live in most parts of the South, and the housing is much cheaper down there. However, when most of these college birds flying south for the fall and winter are asked about why they chose Southern universities, they often say it's because of the campus environment and just how freaking fun school looks down there. Just watch an SEC football game on a Saturday afternoon and you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's get real here. A lot of these northern kids just want to come down south to party their asses off for 4 years. Not sure what that's going to look like when it comes time for them to, actually put their degrees to good use. But I also think it's kind of ironic that college kids are coming to the Bible Belt to get lit and engage in what most non-college folks down south would refer to as pure sin. And of course, there are other factors at play here, such as better weather down south and maybe even a seemingly less oppressive college campus when it comes to freedom of speech or freedom to be a bigot. But the idea that most of these kids are heading down south because they like the politics of southern states is a bit laughable. Generation Z might be one of the most progressive generations we've seen in history. Most of our data shows that anywhere between 80 to 90% of them don't support half of the conservative talking points that have come to dominate the Republican Party. These college students are going down south for the cheap housing, not for the restrictive reproductive laws. Speaking of which, if I was a young woman going down south for college these days, I would be very careful considering that that is the age and environment in which access to reproductive freedom is probably going to be the most important. But at the end of the day, it's going to be interesting to see where all of this leads to when these college students actually graduate. Are they going to stay in the Deep South and raise their families there? Or are they simply going to take their cheaper degree and all the memories of them getting drunk off their ass yelling Roll Tide at a Kid Rock Impersonators concert with them as they move back up north? Only time will tell. But these college kids moving in such large numbers to the South could have a major impact on the politics of southern states. There's a reason why southern states like Georgia have been going blue for the first time in decades, and it has everything to do with population and demographic shifts. I just hope these Southerners continue showing that famous brand of hospitality to these northern Gen Z students when their state ends up electing some progressive senator. Talk about a rolling tide. All right, everybody, I want to thank you all for watching this week's edition of History Now the Future. Now, on this week's Thursday interview episode, I'm going to be sitting down and talking with Sari Beth Rosenberg. She is a U.S. history teacher and an AP U.S. history teacher serving the New York City area. She's also a public school teacher, so we're going to talk a little bit about that in our interview. We had a very interesting, long-ranging conversation about education in America, how it relates to this year's chaotic sense of politics. Also, I want to thank her because she is actually the one that sparked this idea about what political system we're currently living in. Me and her had a conversation about how we both think the 2024 election is going to lead to some sort of political realignment in America. So thank you to her for sparking that idea. And please watch that interview. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the page so you never miss an episode. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you guys next time.